Before the first moment, there was no before. This is the hardest thing to hold in the mind, and it is worth staying with for a little while before the story moves on. We are creatures of sequence. We understand things by their order. This happened, and then this happened, and then this. The idea of a state in which that structure does not exist, in which there is no then, no after, no yet, is not something the mind grasps easily. It is something the mind can only approach from the outside, the way you can approach a very deep body of water and look down into it without ever quite reaching the bottom with your eyes. There was no darkness before time. Darkness is a condition, and conditions require time to exist in. There was no silence. Silence is the absence of sound, and absence is a relationship between what is and what is not, and relationships require time to be felt. There was nothing that could be called a state at all, because a state is something that persists, and persistence is time's most basic gift to the world, and that gift had not yet been given. What there was chaos, not chaos in the ordinary sense of the word, not disorder or confusion or the frantic energy of things without organization. Chaos in its oldest and truest sense, the yawning openness, the boundless nothing that was also, paradoxically, the source of everything. It was not empty, in the way a room is empty when its furniture has been removed. It was empty in the way that a possibility is empty, in the way that the space before a word is spoken is empty, full of everything the word might be, committed to none of it. From this, things began to emerge, not quickly. Quickly has no meaning without time, and time had not yet arrived. Things emerged the way the deepest truths emerge, not by being made or decided or caused, but by becoming inevitable, by being what the nature of things required, by arriving at exactly the moment that was the only moment they could have arrived at, which is to say, they arrived at once and always, and in no particular sequence at all. Gaia came, Tartarus came, Eros came, and among the first of all things, moving in a way that was unlike the moving of anything else, because it was the moving that made all other moving possible. Chronos came. He did not arrive with sound or light, or any of the dramatic signatures that later powers would use to announce themselves. He arrived the way he would always be, quietly, gradually, in a way that was only recognizable in retrospect. One moment, if moment can be said to have existed yet, there was the static condition of chaos, everything and nothing held in perfect and motionless suspension. And then there was the faintest possible sense of something shifting, not a movement exactly, more like the difference between a held breath and a released one, more like the difference between a question and the silence that follows it when an answer is beginning to form. That was Chronos. He was not what the later imagination would make of him. He was not an old man with a scythe, not the grim harvester of mortal lives that a much later age would picture when it thought of time. He was something older and stranger, and in some ways more beautiful than that image allows. He was serpentine, his body coiled in long, slow curves through the space that was not yet space, his scales the color of something between silver and darkness, each one catching a light that did not yet exist and returning it as something that was not quite color and not quite shadow, but something anterior to both. His three heads, of a man, a bull, and a lion, held in them the faces of past and present and future, the three tenses of existence made into flesh, and all three were calm with the particular calm of something that has never been surprised, because surprise requires the existence of an unexpected moment, and Chronos was the maker of moments. He moved through the not yet world, and his movement was the first movement, And in being the first movement, it was also the definition of movement, the template from which all other movement would be derived. Before him, nothing had ever been in one place, and then in another. Before him, the word then had no meaning. He moved and then existed as a concept for the first time. And with then came before and after and soon, and once and long ago, all the words that stitch experience into something that can be lived in rather than merely endured. He found the egg. It was there in the way that things are there when they have always been there, without explanation, without origin, without any obvious cause for their presence other than the deep fact that they belong exactly where they are. It was vast in a way that vastness is difficult to communicate, because the egg was not vast in relation to other things. There were no other things yet, in relation to which it could be measured. It was vast in an absolute sense, vast in itself, the way that potential is vast, not because of what it is, but because of what it contains. Inside the egg was everything, not symbolically, not metaphorically, actually, literally, in whatever mode of being is appropriate to things that exist before the world has decided on its rules. Everything that would ever exist was present inside that egg in its unformed state. Every mountain that would rise, and every valley that would deepen between them, every sea, and every river that would find its way to the sea, every creature that would swim or walk or fly or burrow, every god that would claim a domain, and every mortal that would pray to those gods, and every word that would be spoken in every prayer, every moment of grief, and every moment of joy, and every ordinary unremarkable moment in between, which are the most numerous of all, and in their numerousness the most important. It was all there, waiting, held in the smooth curve of the shell, the way a note is held in the breath of a singer who has not yet opened their mouth. Chronos coiled around it. He did this slowly, with a deliberateness that was not careful in the way that fragile things are handled carefully, but deliberate in the deeper sense, the sense of a thing doing exactly what it was made to do, with the complete and unhurried commitment of something that has no other purpose, and therefore brings its entire nature to the one purpose it has. His long body wrapped around the curve of the egg in a slow spiral, his scales settling against the shell with the soft sound of something finding its right place, and the egg was warm against him, or he was warm against the egg, the direction of that warmth being impossible to determine because they belonged to each other in a way that made the distinction meaningless. He breathed. This was the first breath. Before it, nothing in existence had ever drawn air in and released it, had ever experienced the fundamental rhythm of taking something in and letting it go, that most basic of all, the cycles that would later organize the living world. Chronos breathed, and the breath moved around the egg in a slow current, and the current was the first weather, the first wind, the first suggestion that the air, which did not yet exist as air but was something like what air would become, was capable of movement and direction and the carrying of warmth from one place to another. The breath went in, a long, slow inhalation, the duration of which would have been immeasurable by any instrument that did not yet exist. And then it released, and then in again, and then out, each cycle subtly different from the last, each cycle advancing something so imperceptibly that the advancement was not visible in any individual breath, but only in the accumulated effect of all of them together. The way ashore is changed not by any single wave, but by the patient sum of all the waves that have ever reached it. Time was passing. This was new. This was the first thing that had ever been new, because newness requires change, and change requires time. And time was now passing for the first time in the history of everything. Chronos coiled around the egg and breathed, and time passed around him and through him, and because of him, and the not-yet world began very slowly, in the way that the deepest and most permanent changes always begin, to become something other than what it had been. The egg was changing too, not visibly, not in any way that would have been apparent from moment to moment, but across the long, slow accumulation of Chronos's breathing, across the first ages of time, moving through the not-yet world like a river learning the shape of its own banks. Something inside the egg was organizing itself. The everything inside it was sorting itself into the forms it would eventually take. The mountains were deciding they were mountains. The seas were feeling the particular pull of their own nature, settling toward the low places in preparation for the day when low places would exist for them to settle into. And Chronos breathed, and the world prepared itself for the moment that was coming, the moment that all this slow and patient preparation was moving toward, the moment when the shell would crack and the light would come, and everything inside the egg would spill out into the waiting universe and begin the long, complex, beautiful, painful work of being real. But that moment had not yet arrived, for now there was only the dark and the egg and the slow coiling body of the god of time wrapped around it, and the breath moving in its patient rhythm, and the first and deepest silence in the history of the world, which was not empty but full, not nothing but everything, not an ending but the longest and most profound of all beginnings. The breath moved in its patient rhythm around the egg, and the dark held everything in its ancient fullness, and Chronos coiled and breathed, and the first ages of time continued their slow and imperceptible work. Then Enki came. She did not come from somewhere else. That is the important thing to understand about her arrival, the thing that distinguishes it from the arrival of things that travel from one place to another. She did not travel. She emerged, the way Chronos had emerged, the way all the first things emerged, not by moving through space but by becoming inevitable, by reaching the point at which their existence was no longer a possibility but a requirement, a logical necessity of the deepest kind, the kind that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the nature of things. She was Enki, necessity, the force that makes certain things not merely likely but inescapable, not merely probable but written into the foundation of what existence is. She was the reason that what goes up must come down, that what begins must end, that what is young must age, that what is born must die. Not the cause of these things, in any mechanical sense, something deeper than cause, the condition that makes these things true, the ground beneath the ground on which all the rules of the world are built. Her form was like his and unlike his, serpentine, coiling, ancient in the way that only the very first things are ancient, not old in the way that old things are old, accumulated and weathered and worn, but ancient in the sense of being prior, of existing before the categories that produce oldness had yet been established. Where Chronos was silver dark and calm, Enki was something else. Not lighter exactly, but different in quality, her presence carrying in it the particular weight of the unavoidable, the feeling you get when you understand that something is going to happen, and that there is nothing to be done about it except to be present for it. They recognized each other. This recognition was not surprise. Neither of them was capable of surprise. Chronos because he was time and time contains no unexpected moments. Enki because she was necessity, and necessity contains no contingency. But recognition is not the same as surprise. Recognition is the acknowledgement of a rightness that was always true, but is now, in this moment, being experienced directly. They recognized each other the way two halves of a single thing recognize each other when they are brought together, not with the excitement of novelty, but with the deep, quiet settling of something returning to the shape it was always meant to have. They coiled together around the egg. The movement of this was slow. Everything in this first time before time had fully established itself was slow, operating at a scale so large that what would later be called patience was simply the natural pace of things. They coiled around the egg together, their bodies moving in a spiral that was not random but patterned, each curve answering the last. The two of them together forming around the egg a structure of extraordinary complexity and perfect order, the first pattern in the history of patterns, the original of which all later patterns would be echoes. Consider what they were together. Chronos was time, the movement, the sequence, the river of moments flowing from what had been toward what would be. Enki was necessity, the law beneath the laws, the force that determined which of all the possible rivers of time were the ones that would actually flow. Without Chronos, Enki had nothing to be necessary in. Without Enki, Chronos had no direction, no shape, no banks to flow between. They were each other's requirement. Each was the condition that made the other meaningful. This is what their coiling together meant. Not partnership in the ordinary sense, not two separate things choosing to be close. Something more fundamental. Two aspects of the same deep truth finding the form that expressed their relationship most honestly, which was this: wound around each other, inseparable, each the context in which the other made sense. Together they breathed, 2 breaths now, moving around the egg in their slow rhythm. And where the 2 breaths met and mingled, something happened that had not happened before. The air, still not yet air, still that something that was becoming what air would be, carried in it the combined quality of both their natures. Time and necessity moving together through the space around the egg, and their movement was not simply the sum of 2 separate movements, but something new, something that could not have existed with only one of them present. It was the first law, not a law that was decided or declared or written anywhere. A law in the older and truer sense, a regularity that emerged from the nature of things, a pattern that established itself because the underlying conditions required it. Where time and necessity coil together around the potential of all things, what emerges is order, not the rigid order of a thing controlled and constrained, but the deeper order of a thing expressing its own nature completely and without resistance. The order of a river finding its course, the order of a crystal growing in solution, the order of everything slowly becoming what it is. The egg responded. This is the word the old stories use, and it is the right word, even though it implies a kind of awareness that may or may not have been present. The egg responded to the combined presence of Chronos and Enki the way a seed responds to warmth and water. Not with any conscious intention, not with any decision, but with the deep biological rightness of a thing doing what it was made to do when the conditions it requires are finally present. Something inside the egg shifted, not the crack, not yet. Something earlier than the crack, something preparatory. A settling of the interior toward the configuration that would eventually make the crack inevitable. Inside the egg, the everything was organizing itself more purposefully now. Chronos felt this through the shell. He felt it the way he felt everything. Not as a sensation in any ordinary sense, because sensation requires a nervous system and a moment of experience, and he was the thing that made moments possible, rather than a thing that experienced them in the way mortals later would. He felt it as a change in the quality of time around the egg, a subtle thickening. The way time thickens around things that are about to happen, the slight slowing of the moments immediately before a significant event that you can only notice in retrospect, only feel when you are old enough and still enough to have learned what that particular quality of waiting means. Something was coming, not soon. Soon was still a concept too small for the scale at which these events were occurring, but coming in the deeper sense, present in the future, the way the future is always present in the now if you are old enough and quiet enough to feel it. Chronos felt it. Ananke felt it. They continued their slow coiling around the egg, and their breathing continued in its patient rhythm, and the darkness around them was warm with the warmth of the egg, and the warmth of their own ancient bodies, and the warmth of everything that was waiting inside the shell for the moment of its release. The world egg was not a simple thing. This is worth staying with for a moment, in the way that this whole story asks you to stay with things, not rushing past them toward what comes next, but letting them be fully present, fully themselves, before the current of the story carries you forward. The egg was not a container in the way that containers are ordinarily understood. It was not a shell with contents inside it, the way a bird's egg contains a developing creature in a pocket of nutrients. It was something more intimate than that, more complete. The shell and the contents were not separate things. They were the same thing in different modes. The outside and the inside of a single reality, the boundary and what the boundary enclosed, inseparable in the way that a thought is inseparable from the mind that thinks it. What was inside the egg was not waiting to get out. It was not pressing against the shell with the impatience of a creature that has outgrown its space. It was ripening. That is the word that comes closest to what was happening, though it is a word borrowed from the world of growing things, and applied here to something that predates all growing things and was in some sense their origin. The everything inside the egg was ripening, which is to say it was becoming more fully and completely itself, was moving toward the expression of its own nature with a slow and unhurried thoroughness that could not be rushed, because it was not a process that had a schedule, but a process that would complete itself when it was complete, and not before. Chronos breathed around it, and time passed through it, and Ananke held it in the embrace of her necessity, and the ripening continued in the dark. Then there was light, not the light that would later organize itself into the sun and the stars, and the long gold afternoons of the world's mornings. Something prior to all of that. Something that was to ordinary light what a seed is to a forest. Not the thing itself, but the thing from which the thing would grow. The first and most essential expression of what light was before it became any of the particular lights that mortals would later name and measure and worship. It came from inside the egg. A warmth first, a slight increase in the temperature of the shell against Chronos's scales, subtle enough that it might not have been noticed by anything less ancient or less attentive than the god of time himself. Then a quality of the dark around the egg that was different from what it had been. A darkness that was beginning to be aware of itself as darkness, which requires the existence of something that is not darkness in order to make the comparison. Then the shell began very slowly to change, not to crack, not yet, but to become thinner, or more translucent, or something for which no word exists because it had never happened before, and the language that would eventually develop to describe things had not yet been invented. and would in any case not have had a word for this particular change, because it happened only once in the history of everything. The shell became something that light could almost pass through, and from inside, the light pressed outward with the gentle insistence of something that has been waiting for exactly this. Not impatiently, because patience and impatience both require time, and time was the thing that Chronos was providing, but with the complete and total commitment of something that knows in whatever way things know anything before knowing has been invented, that it is ready. Chronos tightened his coil very slightly, not to hold the egg closed, not to prevent what was coming. He tightened his coil the way you might draw a breath before something important happens, or the way you might hold someone a little closer in the last moment before they go. A gesture that was not resistance but acknowledgement, a recognition that what was about to happen was the end of something as well as the beginning of something, and that endings deserve a moment of attention, even when they are also the most magnificent of beginnings. The light inside the egg grew, and Anki coiled closer too, her body settling against the shell with the quiet certainty of something that has always known this moment was coming, and has been moving toward it since before moving was possible. The two of them together, wound around the egg in their ancient spiral, held the world in the last moment of its unformed perfection, the last moment when everything was still everything and nothing was yet anything in particular. The warmth of the shell moved through Chronos like the warmth of something deeply known. He breathed. The rhythm of his breathing was slow and even and completely unhurried, the breath of something that has all of time and therefore has no need to spend it quickly. In and out, in and out. The darkness around them was luminous now with the light coming through the thinning shell. And the light was not any color yet, but was the potential of all colors. The way white contains within it every color that exists without yet being any of them. And in the warm and luminous dark, the god of time held the world that was about to be born, and breathed and waited. And the waiting was not empty but full, not nothing but the most profound of all somethings. And the shell grew thinner and the light grew stronger and the everything inside pressed gently outward. And Chronos breathed and the ages that had not yet begun leaned forward in the dark toward the moment of their first light. The light pressed outward through the thinning shell, and Chronos breathed his slow breath around the egg, and Ananke held her coil steady, and the warm luminous dark leaned toward the moment that had been coming since before coming was possible. Then the shell cracked. It did not shatter. It did not explode outward with any of the violence that the word cracking can sometimes imply. It opened. That is the more accurate word, though even that is borrowed from a world of doors and hands and the ordinary physics of things that have an inside and an outside. And what happened here was older and stranger than any of that. The shell opened the way a flower opens, not because something broke it, but because it had reached the point in its own development where opening was simply the next thing that its nature required of it, the inevitable expression of a process that had been building since Chronos first coiled his body around its smooth curve and breathed his first breath against it. The light came out, and with the light came Phanes. He was the first, not the first god in the sense that would later be understood, not the first to rule or the first to claim a domain or the first to demand worship. He was the first in the most absolute sense of the word, the first living thing, the first being that was not simply a force or a condition or a presence but a self, a particular and distinct existence with a nature that was its own, and a form that expressed that nature completely. He was light made into a person, or rather, He was the principle of light finding its most concentrated and essential expression in a form that could move and speak and generate. He had wings, great golden wings that caught the new light he was himself producing and sent it outward in every direction, filling the space that had been dark with something that had never existed before, which was the experience of seeing. He was neither male nor female, but both and neither, and something beyond the categories that would later be used to organize such things. He carried within himself the seeds of all life, the genetic possibility of everything that would ever breathe or grow or move through the world that was about to be made. He was Phanes, the shining one, the first light, the original. Chronos watched him emerge. This watching was different from any watching that would later occur in the world, because it was the first watching, the first time that a consciousness had ever directed its attention toward another consciousness and recognized in it a separate existence. Chronos was ancient beyond measure, and he had been present from the very beginning of things. But until this moment he had been present in a world that contained only forces and conditions and the vast unformed potential of the egg. Phanes was the first thing that looked back. He looked back with eyes that were themselves made of light, that saw not in the way that mortal eyes would later see, gathering reflected light and sending it inward to be processed, but in the more direct way of something that is itself the source of what it perceives. He saw Chronos coiled around the fragments of the shell, and he saw Ananke beside him, and he saw the new world opening around them all. And what was in his gaze was not surprise, because he had emerged from the egg that contained all things and therefore knew in whatever mode of knowing is available to a being that has just been born, everything that there was to know. What was in his gaze was something closer to recognition, a greeting, an acknowledgement of what had come before him and made his emergence possible. Chronos received that gaze and was still with it for a long moment. Then Phanes began to make the world. He moved through the new space that his own light was revealing, and everywhere he moved things came into being, not because he commanded them or constructed them from raw materials, but because his presence was the condition under which potential became actual, under which the everything that had been inside the egg began to find its particular forms. He was the catalyst. He was the warmth that allowed the seed to become the plant, the light that allowed the eye to see, the first cause that was not so much a cause as a release, a permission, a signal to all the waiting possibilities that the time had come. Mountains rose in the places where the earth was thickest in its desire to be high. Valleys formed between them as the counterpart that mountains require, the low places that give meaning to the high ones. Water gathered in those valleys, and the first rivers began their long, patient journeys toward the sea, which was already forming in the lowest places of all, pulling water to itself with the particular gravity of very large things. The sky established itself above all of this, not as a ceiling but as a depth, a space of extraordinary extent that would later hold weather and stars and the long transits of the sun and the moon, but for now simply stretched upward from the new earth with the uncomplicated immensity of something that has just discovered what it is. And Chronos moved through all of it. This is the thing about Chronos that is most difficult to see clearly, because it requires holding two ideas together that ordinarily seem separate. He was not a witness to the making of the world. He was not standing to one side watching Phanes work, observing the emergence of mountains and seas and sky as a spectator observes a performance. He was the medium through which all of it was occurring. Every mountain that rose was rising through time. Every river that began its journey to the sea was beginning that journey through time. Every moment of the new world's formation was a moment because Chronos was there, because time was passing, because the sequence of events that constitutes the making of anything was only possible because something was providing the sequence. He was in everything, not in the way that a presence inhabits a space, but in the way that a river inhabits its current. He was the currentness of everything, the quality of movement and change, and the passage of one state into another that made the whole vast project of creation possible. Without him, Fans's light would have illuminated nothing, because there would have been no before to contrast with the after of illumination. Without him, the mountains could not have risen, because rising is a change, and change is time's most basic product. He was everywhere, and he was invisible, and he was the most important thing in the new world, and he was noticed by almost nothing. This did not trouble him. He was not made for being noticed. A river does not need the fish that swim in it to acknowledge the water. He moved through the new world in his slow and serpentine way, and he felt the world taking shape around him and through him, and he felt the rightness of it, the deep satisfaction of a thing doing what it was made to do in the place it was made to do it. Then the Golden Age began. It arrived the way he arrived, not with announcement, not with any single defining moment that could be pointed to and called the beginning. It arrived gradually, through the accumulation of many small things becoming true at once. The earth was warm. The air was mild and clean with the freshness of something that had never been breathed before. The plants grew without being cultivated. The trees offered their fruit without being asked. The rivers ran clear and cold and sweet. The distance between what was needed and what was available was very small, and the distance between the divine and the mortal, in those first ages when mortals were still new to the world, and carried in them the brightness of their recent making, was also very small. Chronos presided over this age. The word presided is borrowed here from the world of rulers and courts and formal authority, and it does not quite fit, but there is no better word available. He did not rule the Golden Age the way a king rules a country. He did not direct it or govern it or make decisions about what it should be. He was its condition. He was the quality of time in which it existed, and the quality of time in the Golden Age was different from what it would later become in ways that are worth describing slowly. Time in the Golden Age moved like deep water, not slowly in any absolute sense. The sun still crossed the sky and the seasons still turned. The days followed each other in their orderly way, but slowly in the way that matters, in the way that is felt. Each moment had a fullness to it, a completeness, a sense of being entirely itself, rather than being a passage between what had just happened and what was about to happen. This is the quality of time that is most difficult to maintain in the later ages, the quality most mourned by those who feel its absence, the sense that the present moment is sufficient, that now is enough, that there is nowhere else that existence needs to be in order to be whole. In the Golden Age, now was always enough. The mortals who lived in that age felt this as a kind of ease, though they would not have called it that, because they had nothing to compare it to. They moved through their days without the particular urgency that time would later develop, without the sense of running out that would become so characteristic of mortal experience in the ages to come. They grew old eventually, because Chronos was still time, and time still moved, but they grew old the way a tree grows old, without crisis, without the feeling of theft, accumulating years the way a landscape accumulates character, becoming more rather than less with each season that passed through them. Chronos felt their lives as small warm currents in the larger current of his own existence. Each mortal life was brief by the measure of a god's attention, but brief in the way that a single note is brief in a long piece of music. Not negligible, not unimportant, but complete in itself, carrying its own meaning, contributing its particular quality to the whole. He did not mourn their brevity, he carried it. He held each brief life in the current of his passing the way a river holds a leaf, carrying it gently, not hurrying it, letting it travel at its own pace until it reached the end of its journey. The gods moved through the Golden Age too, young in the way that even very old things are young when the world is young. Before the weight of experience has accumulated to the point where it changes the quality of their presence, they were large and bright and careless in the way of things that have not yet learned what cannot be undone. They moved through the warm world and they were glad, and their gladness was part of the quality of that age, part of what made the time feel the way it felt, expansive and generous, and lit from within by something that was not quite joy but was the condition from which joy is made. Chronos moved through it all, through the warm days and the mild nights, and the generous earth and the bright young gods and the brief mortal lives. He moved through the Golden Age the way he moved through everything, without interruption, without preference, without the slight acceleration or deceleration that would later become characteristic of time in ages that were more complex and more difficult. He was even, he was constant, he was the ground beneath everything, the current through which all the brightness of that first age moved on its way from where it had been to where it was going. And the Golden Age was good, not perfect in any absolute sense. Chronos was too old and too honest for the idea of perfection, which is a concept that belongs to things that can imagine their own improvement, but good in the deep and simple sense of being what it was, completely and without reservation, in the time that had been given to it. The world was young and warm and generous, and the quality of time was ease, and the ease was real. It would not last. Nothing lasts. This is the oldest truth in Chronos' long experience, the truth that he himself embodies simply by existing, that time moves and moving changes everything it touches, and nothing that is touched by time remains what it was. The Golden Age would end, not because of any failure or any crime or any single cause that could be named and blamed. It would end because ending is what ages do, because time is not a condition of preservation but a condition of change, and change does not distinguish between what we wish would stay and what we are ready to release. But it had not ended yet, for now the world was warm, and the mortals moved through their brief bright lives, and the gods were young and careless, and the rivers ran clear and sweet, and Chronos moved through all of it in his slow and patient way, carrying it forward moment by moment into the next moment and the next, giving each moment the full weight of his attention, and then releasing it, the way breath is drawn in and released, the way every wave rises and falls, the way everything that has a beginning moves in its own time and at its own pace toward whatever comes next. The Golden Age moved through its long warm days, and Chronos carried it forward moment by moment, each moment full and unhurried, and the world was generous, and the mortals were easy in their brief lives, and the gods were bright and young, and the quality of time was stillness within movement, depth within passage, the particular ease of a current that has not yet learned the meaning of urgency. And then slowly it began to change, not on any particular day, not because of any single event that could be identified and pointed to as the cause. It changed the way light changes in the late afternoon, continuously, imperceptibly, each moment indistinguishable from the one before it, and yet the accumulated effect of all those imperceptible changes producing something unmistakably different from what had been. The Golden Age did not end. It became something else. It became the Silver Age, and the becoming was so gradual that no one who lived through the transition could have said with any certainty when one thing had finished and the other had begun. Chronos felt it. He felt it in the quality of the time he was carrying, the way a river feels a change in the landscape it is moving through, not by stopping or altering its own nature, but by the subtle shift in resistance, the slight change in the weight of what it is carrying, the way the current adjusts without deciding to adjust, because adjustment is simply what currents do when the conditions around them change. The time of the Silver Age was different from the time of the Golden Age in ways that were difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore once you had known both. The fullness was still there. The moments of the Silver Age were still real moments, still complete in themselves, still capable of the kind of presence that had characterized the First Age, but they had acquired an edge they had not had before, a faint awareness of their own passing, a slight transparency, as if each moment, even while it was fully itself, was also already showing through to the moment that would follow it, was already in some small way in the process of becoming the past. In the Golden Age, now had been sufficient. In the Silver Age, now was still sufficient, but it knew that it was sufficient, and knowing changed the quality of the sufficiency in a way that was subtle and real and irreversible. The mortals felt this too. They began to notice time in a way they had not noticed it before, not obsessively, not with the anguish that would come in later ages, but with a new quality of awareness, a consciousness of the seasons as something that moved, that progressed, that carried things away as well as bringing things toward. They began to build shelters against the winter, which in the Golden Age had been mild enough to be endured without preparation. They began to plant seeds deliberately, rather than simply gathering what grew, taking the first steps toward the long project of agriculture, which is the project of intervening in time, of taking what the present offers and shaping it with an eye toward what the future will require. They were learning to think about tomorrow. This was new. In the Golden Age, tomorrow had been simply the continuation of today, assumed and unconsidered. Now it was something to be thought about, prepared for, worried about in the mild and productive way that produces forethought rather than anxiety. The Silver Age mortals were the first to experience the future as something distinct from the present, the first to feel in themselves that particular human quality of living in two times at once, in the now of their experience and in the anticipated now of what was coming. Chronos moved through their changed lives and felt the new complexity in them. He did not judge it. Judgment was not within his nature. He was time, and time does not prefer one age to another, any more than a river prefers one stretch of its course to another. The Golden Age had been what it was. The Silver Age was what it was. Both were real. Both were carried by the same current, held in the same vast and patient body of his existence, given the same quality of attention. But he felt the difference. He was honest enough for that. The quality of the time he was carrying had thickened slightly, had acquired a texture it had not previously had, and the texture was the texture of experience accumulating, of the world learning through living in itself what it was. Then came the Bronze Age. The change this time was sharper, not sudden. Nothing in the movement of ages is ever truly sudden. the word sudden belonging to the scale of individual moments rather than the scale at which ages operate, but sharper in the sense of being more pronounced, more unmistakable. The difference between silver and bronze more clearly felt than the difference between gold and silver had been, as if the process of change was itself accelerating, as if time was learning to move faster as it grew more practiced at the work of changing things. The Bronze Age mortals were harder than their predecessors, not cruel, not yet, but harder in the way that things become hard when they have been shaped by difficulty rather than ease. They were made for conflict in a way that the earlier mortals had not been. They had bronze in their tools and bronze in their temperaments, strong and functional and without the soft warmth of gold, without the cool refinement of silver, but capable in ways that the earlier ages had not required capability. They built walls, they made weapons, they looked at the world around them not only as something to live in, but as something to contend with, and this looking changed both them and the world they looked at. Time in the Bronze Age moved differently again. It moved with more urgency now. The fullness of the Golden Age moments, the slight transparency of the Silver Age moments, these had given way to something leaner, more driven, moments that were less interested in being fully themselves and more interested in producing the next moment, in advancing toward some goal or resolution that was always just ahead. The mortals of the Bronze Age lived in a time that felt pressured in a way their ancestors had not experienced, not by any external force, but by the internal logic of lives that were organized around conflict and achievement, and the constant negotiation of a world that was no longer simply generous. Chronos carried this new quality of time the way he carried all qualities of time, without resistance, without preference, with the absolute and total acceptance of something that is not capable of withholding itself from what it is asked to carry. But he felt the weight of it differently. The Golden Age had been light in his current, floating easily, requiring very little from him except his steady presence. The Bronze Age was heavier, not heavy in any way that troubled him. He was time, and time is equal to any weight, but heavy in the way that dense things are heavy, in the way that experience compressed by difficulty and sharpened by conflict has a greater mass than experience that has moved easily through a gentle world. He thought about the egg. He found himself returning, in whatever mode of returning is available to a being that is always present everywhere, in its own existence, to the memory of the time before the egg cracked, not with nostalgia. Nostalgia requires a preference for the past over the present, and Chronos had no preferences among the ages he carried, but with a particular quality of attention, a revisiting of that first stillness, the way you might return in your mind to the place where a river begins, where it is still small and clear and cold, and moving with the uncomplicated purposefulness of something that has not yet gathered the complexity of its lower reaches. The world egg had contained everything, all the ages, gold and silver and bronze and whatever would come after, had been present inside it in their unformed state, waiting in the everything of the egg's interior for the particular sequence of time that would bring each of them into their moment. The Golden Age had not been better than the others. It had simply been first, and firstness has a quality that later things do not have, a quality of pure beginning that can never be repeated, that can only be carried in memory with a particular tenderness reserved for things that cannot be returned to. He had held that egg for a very long time. He thought about this now, moving through the Bronze Age with its urgency and its walls and its bronze-tempered mortals, and he felt the long distance between the first coiling around the smooth, warm shell and this current moment. And the distance was not emptiness but fullness, filled to its entire extent with everything that had happened in the interval. Every Golden Age morning and every Silver Age preparation for winter, and every Bronze Age wall rising from ground that had once been open and unhurried. All of it was in him. All of it was time, and time was him. And none of it was lost or gone or over in any final sense, because nothing that passes through time truly leaves it. The ages were accumulating in him. This is the thing that distinguished Chronos from all the other powers in the world. The thing that made his existence unlike any other existence. Everything that happened, happened in him. The gods who were born and grew into their powers lived their long lives in the medium of his being. The mortals who were born and grew and aged and died, each generation passing through the world like a wave passing through water. All of them moved through him, were carried by him, were held in the current of his existence from their first breath to their last. The mountains that rose and the rivers that carved their courses and the seas that shifted their boundaries across the long geological ages, all of this was the content of his life. He was the largest library in existence, not by intention, not by design, but simply by nature. Everything that had ever happened was a part of him, was written in the continuous text of his existence, was present in the accumulated depth of all the time that had passed through his being. The Golden Age was in him, the Silver Age was in him, the Bronze Age was in him, and everything that would come after was already moving toward him, already on its way, already part of the future that was always becoming his present, and then his past in the endless flowing movement of what he was. The Bronze Age continued its hard and driven life above him and through him. Walls were built and walls fell. Conflicts began and ran their course and ended, and left in the ground the particular residue of endings, which is not nothing but something changed, something that was one thing and is now another. The way a fire leaves ash that is genuinely different from the wood it was and yet made entirely of the same material. Chronos carried it all, each wall, each conflict, each ordinary day between the conflicts when someone woke in the morning and tended their fire and fed their children, and looked at the sky and felt briefly in the space between one thought and another the same quality of presence that the Golden Age mortals had felt as a constant condition of their lives. Those moments were still there, in every age, in every quality of time. Those moments were still available, harder to find perhaps, requiring more stillness to reach, more deliberate quieting of the urgency that the later ages had introduced into the texture of time, but present, always present, because they were part of what time was, part of what Chronos carried, and Chronos carried everything without exception and without preference, the urgent and the still, the heavy and the light, the ages of gold and the ages of bronze, and all the ordinary unmarked days that made up the vast majority of every age, and that no poet had ever named, but that were in the deep arithmetic of existence the greater part of everything. The Bronze Age moved toward its end in the slow, inevitable way of ages. The world was older now than it had been. The mortals were harder. The gods had begun to settle into their particular domains and their particular natures, had begun to develop the rivalries and the attachments and the long, complicated relationships with each other and with mortals that would occupy so much of the next age. The world was filling up with its own history, and the history was pressing down on the present with a weight that had not been there in the beginning, and the present was bending slightly under that weight, changing its shape in response to the accumulated pressure of everything that had already happened. Chronos felt this as a change in the density of what he was carrying, not heavier in the sense of being burdensome, heavier in the sense of being richer, more layered, more complex in its texture than the early time had been. The time of the Bronze Age was time that had learned things, time that carried in it the memory of the ages before it, time that was shaped by its own history in the way that all things are shaped by what has passed through them. It was older time, and older time, Chronos had come to understand across the long passage of the ages, was not lesser time but different time, time with more in it, time whose depth was greater because it had accumulated more, time that required a different kind of attention from those who lived in it. He gave it that attention. He always gave everything he carried his full attention. This was not a virtue or a discipline. It was simply his nature. Time attends to everything equally, to the great event and the small one, to the age of gold and the age of bronze, to the extraordinary morning and the ordinary one, to the long life and the short. He was the condition of existence, and existence, in all its forms and all its ages, received from him the same patient and complete presence. It moved through him, and he carried it, and neither the carrying nor the moving was ever hurried, and nothing was ever left behind. The age turned slowly in his current, and the world grew older, and Chronos breathed, and time passed, and the next age leaned forward in the dark of the future toward the moment of its own beginning. The Bronze Age settled into its density and its weight, and Chronos carried it forward in his slow and patient way. And the world grew older and harder and more layered with its own history, and the future leaned toward the present in the way it always does, quietly and without announcement, arriving only when it has fully become itself. Then the Olympians came. They did not come from outside the world. That is the first thing to understand about them, the thing that is easy to miss if you approach their arrival as the arrival of something foreign, something that imposed itself on a world that had existed without it. They came from inside the world, from inside the long process of the world becoming what it was always going to be, from inside the current of Chronos himself. They were the world's next expression of its own nature, the form that the everything from the egg had been moving toward through all the long ages of gold and silver and bronze. Zeus came with his thunder, Hera came with her gravity, Poseidon came with the sea already in his hands, the deep water already his, already answering the particular quality of his presence, the way a familiar instrument answers the touch of the player who has spent a lifetime learning it. Demeter came with the grain. Apollo came with a light of a different kind than Phanes had been. Not the first light, the original light, but a cultivated light, a light that had learned to be beautiful in specific and nameable ways. Artemis came with the moon and the hunt, and the deep quiet of forests at night. Athena came with the particular brightness of a mind that has learned to love its own precision. Aphrodite came with love in all its forms, the gentle and the devastating equally. Ares came with conflict, not the simple hard conflict of the Bronze Age, but conflict as a principle, as a divine force, as something that the world apparently required in sufficient quantity to warrant its own god. Hephaestus came with fire tamed into craft, the extraordinary human discovery that heat could be made to serve rather than simply to consume, given a divine face and a divine name. Hermes came with the speed of thought and the ease of transition, the god of all the places between places, all the moments between moments, Dionysus came last and strangest, carrying in his domain the dissolution of boundaries, the particular gift and terror of losing the edges of yourself and becoming briefly something larger and less defined. 12 of them, settling into their domains on Olympus like elements, settling into their natural arrangement, each one the precise expression of a force that the world had been generating since the egg cracked, and Phanes first spread his golden wings in the new light. Chronos felt their arrival the way he felt everything, as a change in the quality of the time he was carrying. The Olympians brought with them a new texture to the world's experience of time. They were immortal, which is to say they did not age and did not die, but they were not timeless. They existed in time. They experienced sequence and change and the passage of events. They had moods that shifted and relationships that evolved and long histories with each other that accumulated over the ages the way all histories accumulate, through the patient addition of experience to experience, moment to moment, until the weight of the shared past between two beings becomes a kind of landscape that both of them must navigate whenever they meet. They were inside him. This is what Chronos understood about the Olympians, that the Olympians did not always understand about themselves. They were immensely powerful. Zeus's thunder could shatter mountains. Poseidon's trident could crack the foundations of the world. Ares's presence in a conflict could turn its outcome in ways that no merely mortal force could counter. And yet all of this power, all of this divine immensity, existed inside time, was carried by time, was made possible by time in the same way and to the same degree that the smallest and most fleeting mortal life was made possible by time. Without Chronos, Zeus could not throw his thunder, not because Chronos would prevent him, but because throwing requires a before and an after, a moment when the hand is raised, and a moment when the bolt has left it. And before and after were Chronos' most basic product, the first and most fundamental gift he gave to everything that existed in the world. Every action that any god or mortal ever took was an action in time, was a sequence of moments, was carried on the current of his existence from its beginning to its end. He was beneath them all, not beneath in the sense of being lesser. This is the misunderstanding that arises from the word, the automatic human habit of reading vertical position as a measure of worth. Beneath in the sense of being foundational, the way the bedrock is beneath the mountain, without which the mountain could not stand, without which the mountain could not be the particular and magnificent thing it is. The Olympians stood on Chronos the way mountains stand on bedrock, drawing their height and their solidity from the ancient and invisible support beneath them. He did not need them to know this. He had never needed anything from the beings that moved through him. A river does not need the fish that swim in it to acknowledge the water. The water is simply there, simply itself, simply providing the medium without which the swimming would be impossible. And this is sufficient. This has always been sufficient. But he watched them. He watched them with the quality of attention that only the very oldest things are capable of. Not the focused, narrowed attention of someone looking at a specific thing, but the broad and patient attention of something that contains everything in its field of awareness at once, that does not need to turn toward one thing because it is already turned toward all things, that does not need to look more closely because it is already as close as it is possible to be, which is to say, inside everything, beneath everything, woven through everything. He watched Zeus learn what power was, not the crude version of power, the simple version that Chronos the Titan had practiced, the power of containment, of swallowing, of preventing. Zeus learned a more complex power, the power of a king who understands that the authority to decide is only as good as the wisdom with which it is exercised, that thunder is a useful tool and a catastrophic policy. He made mistakes, many of them. In the early ages of his reign on Olympus, he was impetuous and proud, and his confidence in his own judgment outran the judgment itself, as it does in all young rulers, divine or mortal. And Chronos carried each mistake and each correction and each slow improvement in the same unhurried current, giving Zeus the one thing that turns mistakes into wisdom, which is time enough to feel the full consequence of what has been done, and time enough to understand what a different choice would have produced. He watched Aphrodite move through the world. Her domain was the most intimate of all the divine domains, the most deeply woven into the daily texture of mortal and immortal life. Every love story that ever happened, from the brief and ordinary to the long and legendary, passed through her in some sense and through Chronos in every sense. He felt them all. Every love had a duration. Every love existed in time, was shaped by time, was altered by the passage of time in ways both beautiful and painful. He watched Aphrodite inspire the loves that would tear families apart and build cities and end wars and start them. And he felt each of those loves as a current within his current, a stream within the larger river, moving at its own pace and with its own temperature, and carrying in it the particular quality of a human life organized around attachment. He watched Athena think. Her mind was the closest thing in the Olympian world to his own quality of existence, not because she was timeless, she was not, but because she had a relationship with sequence that was more deliberate than any of the other gods. She planned. She looked forward into the possible futures and backward into the causes of the present, and she built, in the space between what had been and what might be, the structures of strategy and wisdom that were her particular gift to the world. She moved through time with more conscious awareness of its structure than any other Olympian, and Chronos felt in her intelligence a faint echo of his own nature. The way she took the material that time provided and worked with it carefully, shaping it toward outcomes that required a long view, a patience with the interval between intention and result. He watched Hermes move. If Athena was the Olympian most aware of time's structure, Hermes was the one most comfortable in its cracks. He moved in the spaces between things, between the mortal world and the divine, between the living and the dead, between the moment of intention and the moment of arrival. He was the messenger, which is to say, he was the being most at home in the interval, the space of pure transition that exists between one state and another. Chronos felt a kinship with this too, though kinship is perhaps too personal a word for the relationship between the god of time and any individual being. He recognized in Hermes's ease with transitions something that resonated with his own nature, which was itself nothing but transition, nothing but the constant movement from one moment to the next. The Olympians filled the world with their stories. This is perhaps the most significant thing they brought that had not been present before. Not power, which had always been present in various forms, and not beauty, which Phanes had introduced with his first golden light, but story, narrative, the particular way that events become meaningful when they are connected to each other by the thread of character, when what happens can be understood not just as a sequence of occurrences, but as the expression of a nature, the acting out of a self across time. Before the Olympians, the world had events. After them, the world had stories, and stories Chronos understood as he carried them forward, were the mortal's way of doing what he did, of holding time together, of finding in the movement of events a shape that could be understood and remembered, of making the passage of time into something that meant something rather than simply something that occurred. He was not unchanged by this. He could not be unchanged, because change was what he carried, and carrying changes the carrier over sufficient time. The world full of Olympian story was a richer world than the world before it, richer in the particular way that density is richer than emptiness. The way a river carrying silt is doing more work than a river carrying only water. He moved through the age of the Olympians, and their stories accumulated in him, and he accumulated in them, and the world grew more itself with every passing age, more complex, more layered, more thoroughly the thing it had been becoming since the first moment Phanes spread his wings in the new light of the cracked egg. Poseidon struck the earth and the ground answered. He felt it. He felt every earthquake that had ever occurred and would ever occur, felt them as punctuation in the long text of the world's story, emphatic marks in the slow prose of geological time. Apollo played his lyre, and the music moved through time at the speed of sound, and then was gone, but not gone from Chronos, never gone from Chronos. The sound of every note ever played still present somewhere in the deep current of his existence, not as sound anymore, but as the permanent fact of its having sounded, the unalterable truth that it had occurred. Athena and Poseidon contested over Athens, and the city chose the olive tree. He carried that moment. He carried the weight of Poseidon's pride settling slowly into the sea like sediment settling to the ocean floor, carried the long patience of Athena's satisfaction, carried the first pressing of oil from the first olive grown from the tree she had planted in the cracked rock of the citadel. He carried all of it the way he carried all of it, completely, without preference, with the full and even attention of something that does not know how to give less than everything. Zeus issued his decrees from Olympus, and the decrees moved outward through the world in time, arriving in their effects long after their utterance, each cause producing its consequence across the interval that Chronos provided between intention and outcome. Without that interval nothing could be caused. Without time between the decree and its effect, there is no causation, only simultaneity, which is not cause and effect but simply coincidence. Every law Zeus ever made, every judgment he ever pronounced, was made possible by the time that carried it from its declaration to its consequence. He was beneath all of it, always beneath all of it, the invisible foundation of every divine act, and every mortal life, and every natural process in the world, not honored as he might have been honored, not worshipped as the gods who had domains that mortals could see and touch and sail across were worshipped, not named in prayers as often as the gods, whose interventions were dramatic and specific, and aimed at the individual circumstances of individual lives, but present, always present, moving through everything in his slow serpentine way, his three-headed form carrying the past and the present and the future together in one body, his scales the color between silver and darkness, his breath the rhythm of the seasons, his heartbeat the slow turning of the ages. He moved through the Olympian world, and the world moved through him, and neither the moving nor the being moved through required acknowledgement or thanks or even awareness. It required only what it had always required, which was the same thing it would always require: the patient and continuous and utterly unconditional gift of time itself, given to everything that existed without distinction and without end. The gods shone on Olympus, and mortals built their cities in the valleys below, And the sea moved in its tides, and the earth turned in its seasons, and Chronos breathed, and breathed, and breathed. The Olympians shone on their mountain, and the world moved through its ages, and Chronos breathed beneath all of it. And his breath was the seasons turning, and his heartbeat was the slow passage of years. And the world was full now, full of story and of gods and of the particular bright noise of a universe that had learned to be conscious of itself. And through all of it, woven into every part of it, present in every corner of the world that the Olympians had claimed and named and filled with their tremendous lives, were the mortals. Chronos had known many kinds of existence. He had known the dark before the egg cracked, the long coiling stillness of that first time. He had known the emergence of phanes and the making of the world. He had known the great slow movements of geological time, the rising of mountains and the deepening of seas, change operating at a scale so large that individual moments were invisible within it, the way individual water molecules are invisible within a wave. He had known the Titans in their enormous elemental existence, and the Olympians in their brilliant divine one. But nothing in all of that long experience was quite like the mortals. They were small. This was the first and most obvious thing about them. The thing that the gods noticed and that made some gods careless in their attention, mistaking smallness for insignificance in the way that powerful things sometimes do. They were small, and they were brief, and they were fragile in ways that the divine was not fragile. Subject to cold and hunger and the thousand ordinary difficulties of bodies that required constant maintenance, and that would, regardless of how well maintained, eventually stop working entirely. They were, by the measure of any divine scale, barely there at all, and yet Chronos felt their lives more acutely than he felt anything else in creation. This was not a preference. He reminded himself of this. Return to it the way you return to a truth that requires regular revisiting. It was not that he valued mortal lives more than other lives, or found them more important in any absolute sense. It was that mortal lives were the place where time was most fully felt, where the nature of what he was became most completely visible. The way a river's nature is most visible not in the calm deep stretches, but in the places where it moves over shallows, where every current and eddy and shift in speed is exposed to the surface. Mortals felt time. This was the thing that distinguished them from almost everything else in creation. The mountains existed in time but did not feel it. The sea moved in time, but its experience of that movement was not the experience of something aware of its own passing. The gods existed in time and were shaped by it, but their immortality created a distance between themselves and the passage of time that softened its urgency, blurred its edges, made it something they moved through rather than something they felt against their skin. But mortals felt every moment of it. They were creatures of pure temporal experience, beings for whom the passage of time was not a background condition, but the central and defining fact of their existence. He moved through a single mortal life sometimes, giving it his full attention the way he rarely gave his full attention to any single thing, allowing himself the experience of following one thread through his vast current rather than feeling the current as a whole. He followed a child first, a child in the early world, in a village near the sea, in the kind of ordinary place that exists everywhere, and leaves no particular mark on history, but that contains within it, in any given moment, lives of extraordinary depth and ordinariness. The child woke in the morning with the particular quality of morning attention that belongs only to the very young, completely present, completely without the accumulated history, that would later complicate the experience of simply being awake. The morning was entirely the morning. The light coming through the gaps in the wall was entirely the light. The smell of the fire being started in the next room was entirely that smell, not mixed with memory or anticipation, not shadowed by any previous morning or any imagined future one. Chronos felt this quality of time as the child experienced it, and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was a recognition. The child's experience of the morning was, in some small and imperfect way, a reflection of the way he himself experienced all moments, with complete presence, without the layering of past and future that most conscious beings brought to their experience of now. The child lived in time the way Chronos was time, entirely in the moment, entirely present to what was, without the weight of before or the pull of after. This would change. He knew it would change because he had followed enough mortal lives to know their shape. The way a river guide knows every bend in a river they have traveled 1,000 times. The child would grow, and the accumulation of experience would add itself to each new moment, making each morning not just itself, but also all the previous mornings it resembled, and the loss of that pure presence would be gradual and unnoticed and complete, and the child would not know it had happened until much later, if ever. He followed the child into the afternoon. The afternoon of childhood had a particular quality of time that was different from the morning. It was expansive in a way that adult afternoons rarely managed. An hour of childhood afternoon contained more texture, more event, more fully lived experience than many hours of adult time, because the child had not yet learned to move through time efficiently, had not yet developed the habit of processing experience quickly in order to get to the next experience. Everything was still slow enough to be fully inhabited. The afternoon light on the ground was interesting in itself. The sound of the wind in the trees above was interesting in itself. The small discoveries of a childhood afternoon, a stone with an unusual color, a beetle moving with tremendous purpose across a path, the precise sensation of bare feet on warm earth, each of these was a complete experience, fully attended to, fully felt. Chronos carried the afternoon with the same care he had carried the morning. Then the evening came, and with it the first experience of time that the child had, that was not pure presence but anticipation. Tomorrow there would be something, some small event that the child was looking forward to, and the looking forward changed the quality of the evening, gave it a slight forward lean, a gentle directedness toward what was coming. This was new. This was the child's first experience of the future as a place they were moving toward, rather than simply the next moment arriving as all moments arrive. And with the future came faintly, and for the first time, the past, because anticipating tomorrow required comparing it to other days, required the first use of memory as a tool for navigating time, rather than simply as the accumulation of experience. He felt the child cross that threshold, felt it as a subtle change in the quality of the time that child was living in. Not a loss, not entirely. The gain was real. The capacity to anticipate and remember was the capacity to live in more than one moment at once, to extend the self across time in a way that the purely present experience of infancy did not allow. But something was also left behind. Some quality of the morning's pure presence would never be quite as pure again. He carried that too. The leaving behind was part of the life, was part of what mortal time was. He followed the same thread forward into adulthood. The adult that the child became was someone who had learned, through the long ordinary education of living, to move through time with a competence that had a cost. They moved through their days quickly now, efficiently, processing each moment as it arrived and filing it with the others of its kind. This kind of morning, this kind of afternoon, this kind of conversation, rather than experiencing each one as its own complete and unrepeatable event. They were good at time in the way that practice makes things good. They could navigate it, predict it, plan within it, use it for the purposes of a life that had accumulated goals and responsibilities, and the long, slow weight of everything that had already happened. But sometimes in the spaces between the efficient movement through their days, something broke through, a particular quality of evening light, arriving at an angle that matched a long-ago afternoon, and carrying with it the whole texture of that afternoon, not as a clear memory, but as a feeling, a bodily recognition that bypassed the organizing mind, and arrived directly in the chest, the smell of rain on dry earth, the sound of a specific bird at a specific time of year. These things stopped the efficient movement through time and returned the adult briefly and completely to the pure presence of the child's morning. Chronos felt these moments as the brightest points in a mortal life, not the great events, not the marriages or the battles or the moments of triumph or grief that the poets wrote about and the gods intervened in. These small, involuntary returns to pure presence, these cracks in the efficient surface of adult time through which the child's morning shone, they were brief, they were, by the measure of a life, vanishingly small, but they contained in their brevity the full quality of what time could be when it was fully inhabited. He held them the way he held everything, carefully, completely. He followed the thread forward into old age. Old age was where mortal time became most complex, most layered, most interesting to him, in the particular way that complex things are interesting to something very old. The old person moved through time slowly again, as the child had moved through it slowly, but slowly now for different reasons, not because each moment was new and complete in itself, but because the accumulated weight of all the previous moments had made the present moment rich with resonances, thick with the presence of everything that had led to it. An old person's experience of an ordinary morning was an experience in which every previous morning they had ever known was in some sense present, not as distraction or noise, but as depth, as the quality of having lived a long time in the world, and having that living changed the texture of everything. He found this beautiful. He found the old age of mortals genuinely and specifically beautiful in a way that he did not find other things beautiful, and he was honest with himself about this, even as he reminded himself not to prefer. The beauty was in the convergence, in the way that time, which had been felt by this person as a river moving forward, as a current carrying them from one moment to the next, was now felt as a depth as well as a movement, as a richness as well as a passage, as something that had given, over the long course of a life, as much as it had taken, because time did take. He could not pretend otherwise. Time took everything eventually. The child's morning would not come back. The afternoon's expansiveness would not come back. The specific texture of a specific day in a specific year of a life would not come back in its original form, could only be carried in memory and feeling, could only be approached again in those involuntary moments of return that grew rarer rather than more frequent as the years accumulated. And finally, time would take the life itself, would carry it to the end of its course the way a river carries everything it holds to the sea, and the particular self that had inhabited that life would cease to be a self, and become instead a memory, a story, a presence in the lives of those who had known it. He carried the dying too. This was perhaps the most intimate thing he did, the most private, the least witnessed. He carried the last moments of mortal lives with a care that was not different from the care he gave to any other moment, but that felt different from the inside, if inside was a word that applied to a being who was everywhere at once. The last moments of a mortal life had a quality that no other moments had, a fullness that came from their finality, a presence that came from the absolute and total end of the future, pressing the present into an intensity it had not previously had. He had felt this in every mortal life that had ever ended. He had felt it in the lives of those who died in peace, and those who died in fear, and those who died so quickly they had no time to feel anything at all. And in each case he had carried that final moment with the same unhurried and complete attention, letting it be entirely what it was, not rushing past it toward what came next, honoring the particular irreplaceable weight of a moment that would not be followed by another moment for the self that was experiencing it. And then he carried them forward, not in the same form, not as themselves continuing, but the fact of them continued, the permanent, unalterable fact that they had existed, that they had felt the morning light and the afternoon, and the involuntary returns to presence, and the accumulated depth of their old age. This fact was written into the current of his existence in a way that nothing could erase, because the past is the one thing that time makes permanent. What has happened has happened. This was the oldest truth he knew, older than the Olympians and older than the Titans and older than the egg itself, a truth that was simply the nature of time stated plainly. What has happened has happened. It cannot be undone. It cannot be taken back. It cannot be changed from what it was into something else. The child's morning, that particular pure morning of presence and new light, that morning had happened, and its having happened was now and forever a permanent feature of the universe, written into the deep current of all time, present in Chronos as surely as if it were still occurring. Nothing that has ever been fully felt has been lost. He moved through the mortal world carrying this truth in the way he carried everything, quietly, without announcement, without requiring that the beings whose lives he was carrying understand or acknowledge what was being done for them. The fisherman on the shore who poured wine into the water before setting out, the farmer who watched the sky for signs of rain, the child who would one day be old, and the old one who had once been a child, all of them moved through him. All of them were held in the same patient and eternal current. Above them the Olympians made their great stories, and below them the earth held its ancient patience, and through them all Chronos moved in his slow and serpentine way, breathing the rhythm of the seasons, feeling each mortal life as a bright and brief and irreplaceable thread in the vast fabric of everything that had ever been. He breathed in, he breathed out, the world turned in its slow and faithful way, and the mortals lived their brief and luminous lives, and every moment of every one of those lives was held, completely and forever, in the deep and patient current of time. The mortal lives moved through him like brief bright currents in a deep river, and Chronos carried them with the full weight of his attention, and the world turned in its faithful way, and the seasons breathed through the years in their patient cycle, and all of it was held, all of it was carried, all of it was time. But there was something else, something that had been present since the beginning, and that he had not yet turned his full attention toward. Not because he had avoided it, but because it was the kind of thing that required a particular quality of stillness to approach. The kind of thing that reveals itself only when you stop moving toward it and simply wait for it to arrive. It was his own nature, not his nature as it expressed itself outward, as the carrier of moments, the medium of change, the deep current beneath all things, but his nature as he experienced it from the inside, if inside was a word that applied. The question of what it was like to be time, not what time did or what time was for or how time moved through the world, but what time felt like from the perspective of the thing that was time. This was the question he had been carrying since before questions existed, since before the egg cracked and the world began, and he had never fully answered it because it was not the kind of question that answers itself all at once, but the kind that deepens with each age that passes, revealing new dimensions of itself, the way a very deep body of water reveals new depths each time you look into it. He was a river. He had always understood himself as a river. The river is perhaps the oldest image for time, the one that comes most naturally to mortal minds when they try to think about what time is, and Chronos had always recognized in it something true and something incomplete. True, because a river is always moving, always carrying what it holds from where it has been toward where it is going, always the same river and never the same water, its identity consisting not in any particular collection of molecules, but in the pattern of its movement, the shape of its course, the constancy of its flow. He was like this. He was always moving. He was always the same and never the same. His identity was the pattern, not the content, but the image was incomplete, and the incompleteness was where the most interesting part of his nature lived. A river has a direction. It moves from its source toward its mouth, from the high places toward the low, from the beginning toward the end. And this directionality is so fundamental to what a river is, that it is difficult to imagine a river without it. A river that moved in no direction or in all directions at once would not be recognizable as a river at all. It would be something else, a lake perhaps, or a sea, or something that had no name. But Chronos did not experience himself as having a direction, not in the way that mortals experience time as having a direction. Mortals experience time as moving forward, always forward, carrying them from the past they could remember toward the future they could not yet know, with the present as the narrow moving point of contact between the two. This was real. This was genuinely part of what time was, but it was the mortal experience of time, the experience of a being small enough to stand in one place in the river and feel the current moving past them in one direction. From inside the river, the experience was different. He was the past and the present and the future simultaneously, not in some mystical or metaphorical sense, but in the most literal sense available. He was the being whose body contained all three, whose existence extended equally in all directions through time, who could no more experience the past as gone or the future as not yet here than a mountain can experience the valley as distant. The valley is right there, adjacent, part of the same landscape. And for Chronos, last year and next year and the year 10,000 years from now were all right there, all adjacent, all part of the same landscape of his existence. This was the paradox that he had been carrying since the beginning. He was a river, always moving, always carrying everything forward. And he was also, simultaneously, utterly still. The river moved, and the movement was real, and the direction was real, and the carrying was real. And at the same time, the river had always been exactly where it was, and would always be exactly where it was, and the movement was contained within a stillness so absolute that the movement itself was a form of stillness. The way the spinning of a top is a form of stillness. The way the vibration of a string is a form of stillness. Motion so continuous and so complete that it becomes indistinguishable from rest. He had felt this paradox most clearly in certain moments. In sleep first, when mortals slept, something happened to their experience of time that was unlike anything else in their waking lives. The river slowed. The forward pull of the current relaxed. The future stopped pressing on the present with its usual mild urgency, and the past stopped arranging itself in the usual narratives of cause and effect and consequence. In sleep, time became something more like a pool than a river. Still moving, because even in sleep the heart beat and the lungs breathed and the cells went about their ancient work, but moving with a circularity rather than a directionality, turning within itself rather than pressing forward. Chronos moved through sleeping mortals and felt a quality of time that was closer to his own experience than anything available in the waking world. Not identical. The mortal in sleep was still a mortal, still a being of finite duration, still a creature whose past was behind them and whose future was ahead, still subject to the fundamental conditions of mortal existence. But in sleep those conditions relaxed their grip slightly, and in the relaxation something of the deeper nature of time became accessible. The stillness within the movement, the eternal within the passing, the quality of a moment that is not moving toward anything but is simply completely here. He loved the sleeping world for this reason. He moved through it in the deep hours, through the villages and the cities and the camps of travelers, and the houses of kings, and the beds of the ordinary and the extraordinary alike. And he felt in each sleeping person a brief and imperfect and genuine approach to the quality of time that he himself embodied. They were reaching toward him in their sleep without knowing it, coming as close as mortal consciousness could come to the experience of being the thing that carries all experience, resting in time rather than moving through it, being carried rather than swimming. He did not wake them. He moved through them gently, the way he moved through everything, without disturbance, without leaving any mark except the mark that time always leaves, which is the mark of having passed, which is the mark of having been. Then there were the other moments, the waking moments when something happened that stopped the forward movement of mortal time and created, briefly, the same quality of stillness that sleep produced, but with full consciousness present to experience it. The moment of great beauty. He had felt this in mortals standing at the edge of the sea at sunset, or looking up at a sky full of stars, or hearing a piece of music that arrived in them in a way they had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. In these moments the mortals stopped moving through time, and time stopped moving through them in the usual way, and something opened, a quality of pure present that was wider and deeper than the ordinary present, a now that contained more than now usually contained, that seemed to extend in all directions rather than having the usual narrow forward orientation of waking time. In these moments, Chronos felt, the mortal was touching his nature from the outside, feeling through the surface of their ordinary temporal experience the deeper quality of what time was beneath its surface. The stillness, the simultaneity, the eternal present, that was not a frozen moment but the living ground from which all moments emerged and to which all moments returned. The moment of great grief produced the same opening by a different path. Grief was the experience of time he found most difficult to carry, not because it burdened him. Nothing burdened him, The word burden did not quite apply to something that was equal to everything it carried by definition, but because it was the experience in which mortals came most fully and most painfully into contact with time's nature. In grief, the past became suddenly and overwhelmingly present. The person who had died or the thing that had been lost was still entirely real in memory, still entirely present in the body's expectations, still everywhere in the fabric of the griever's world. And yet they were not here. They were in the past, in the fixed and unalterable past, and the distance between that past and the present was experienced not as a comfortable interval of time, but as an impossible gap, a space that could not be crossed, a wall that had appeared where there had been an opening. Grief was the mortal experience of time's irreversibility, of the truth that the past is permanent, which is, from one direction, a comfort, and from another direction, the most painful thing there is. What has happened, always and forever. The love was real, and its reality is permanent, and the person is gone, and the going is also permanent, both things equally true, both things held in the same current. He carried the grieving with particular gentleness, not with any special intervention. He did not slow time for the grieving, or speed it for them, or alter in any way the fundamental conditions of their experience, but he moved through them with a quality of attention that was, if such a distinction is meaningful for a being of his nature, slightly different from his usual quality of attention, more present perhaps, more fully itself. The way a river might be said to run more clearly in a particular stretch of its course, not because the water is different, but because the riverbed there is clean and unobstructed, and the clarity of the water is simply more visible. And then there were the mystics. In every age, in every culture that mortals built on the surface of the world, there were some among them who discovered, through long practice and deep stillness, a way of approaching directly the quality of time that Chronos embodied. They sat in caves and in gardens and on mountainsides and by rivers. They made themselves very still, and they let the forward pull of the waking mind relax its grip, and they felt in the relaxation the deeper nature of the moment they were in. They felt it as an expansion, the present moment opening outward beyond its usual narrow dimensions to include something that felt, to their limited but genuine perception, like eternity. They were not wrong. They were feeling something real. They were touching, with the outermost edge of mortal consciousness, the quality of time that was most fundamental to its nature, the eternal present, the still point of the turning world, the quality of now that was not a knife edge between past and future, but a depth, a ground, a fullness that contained everything. Chronos felt them finding this, and felt something in response that was not quite recognition and not quite gladness, but something of both. They were the mortals who came closest to understanding what he was, not by thinking about it. Thought was too fast and too directed for this kind of understanding, but by becoming still enough that the understanding could arrive by itself, could seep into them the way water seeps into stone gradually over a long time without force. He moved through them as they sat in their stillness, and he felt their small mortal consciousness touching the edge of his vast temporal existence, and he was with them in it, as he was with everything, as he was always with everything, present, patient, carrying them in the same current that carried all things, the same current that had been flowing since before the egg cracked and Fane spread his golden wings in the first light. The river moved, and was still, both things true, both things always and equally true, the movement real and the stillness real, the passing real and the permanence real. the moment arriving and the moment already eternal, the now always new and the now always ancient, time flowing and time standing, and time being the one thing that contains both of these truths inside itself without contradiction, without resolution, without either one canceling the other. This was what he was, not the river alone, not the stillness alone, both together, inseparable, the movement and the ground of movement, the current and the depth in which the current moved, the passing and the permanent, the moment and the eternity that each moment was a small and perfect expression of. He breathed. The breath moved outward through the world in the slow rhythm it had kept since the first breath around the egg, since before the world had learned what breathing was, since the very beginning of everything. In and out, the same breath, always the same breath, always the first breath, always the last breath, always this breath, here, now, in the eternal and moving present that was his nature and his name, and the oldest and most constant gift he had ever given to the world. The sleeping mortals turned in their beds, and the mystics sat in their stillness, and the river moved, and the deep pool was still, and Chronos breathed and breathed and breathed, and the world turned in the faithful rhythm of its own becoming, and every moment was ancient, and every moment was new, and every moment was here, fully and completely here, held in the vast and patient and eternal present of the God of time. The breath moved through the world in its slow and patient rhythm, and the river flowed and was still, and the mortals slept, and the mystics sat in their quiet, and the world turned in its faithful becoming, and Chronos held all of it, in the same vast and unhurried presence he had always held everything, and in that holding, something was accumulating. It had always been accumulating, since the first moment, since the moment that was the first moment, because Chronos was there to make it a moment. Everything that happened had been adding itself to the sum of what had happened, each event laying itself down in the deep sediment of time, the way sediment lays itself down on the floor of a very old sea, slowly, continuously, without interruption and without end, one layer upon another, each layer the record of a particular time, a particular quality of the world as it was in that moment, pressed down by everything that came after it into something dense and dark and permanent. He was that sediment, he was that accumulation, not in the way that a library accumulates books, where each book is a separate object that can be taken down and examined and returned to its place. The accumulation in Chronos was more intimate than that, more complete. It was the difference between a library and a mind. A library holds its contents at a distance, in organized separation, each thing distinct from every other thing. A mind holds its contents as part of itself, dissolved into the fabric of what it is, inseparable from the thinking that thinks them. Chronos held everything that had ever happened the way a mind holds everything it has ever experienced, not as a collection of separate items, but as the very substance of what he was, woven into his nature so thoroughly that the distinction between the holder and the held had long since ceased to be meaningful. Every word ever spoken was in him. This is worth staying with, not metaphorically, not as a poetic description of time's relationship to human communication, literally, in whatever mode of literalness applies to the existence of a primordial God. Every word that had ever been formed by a mortal mouth and sent into the air was present in Chronos, was part of the vast accumulated content of his existence. The first word a child ever spoke in any language, the last word a dying elder said to the people gathered around them, the words of prayers sent upward to gods who sometimes listened and sometimes did not, the words of arguments and reconciliations and declarations of love and expressions of grief, and the ordinary words of ordinary days that carried no particular weight, except the weight of being the sounds through which one human consciousness reached toward another. He carried them all, not as sound anymore. Sound dissipates. Sound is carried by air, and the air moves on and disperses, and the vibration that was the sound becomes simply the general thermal energy of the atmosphere, no longer distinguishable as the specific sound it was. What Chronos carried was not the sound, but the fact of the sound, the permanent and unalterable truth that it had occurred, that in a specific moment, in a specific place, a specific person had opened their mouth and formed a specific word and sent it into the world. This fact was written into the structure of time itself, was part of the permanent record of what had happened, and nothing, not the death of the speaker, not the death of every person who had heard those words, not the passage of 1,000 years, not the erosion of the landscape in which those words were spoken into something entirely unrecognizable. Nothing could remove that fact from the place where Chronos held it. He thought about the first word, not the first word in any particular language. Languages came later, were the mortal invention of systems for organizing the raw material of communication into something transmissible and learnable. The first word before language, the first time a mortal consciousness organized itself into sound with the intention of meaning something to another mortal consciousness. He had been there. He had carried that moment, that specific extraordinary morning or afternoon or evening when something crossed a threshold that had not previously been crossed, when a sound became a symbol, became a word, became the beginning of the vast and complex human project of saying what things are. He held it still. He thought about the first song, the first time a mortal had done something with sound that was not communication in the ordinary sense, but something else, something that served no immediate practical purpose, but that answered a need that was real and deep and apparently as fundamental to mortal existence as the need for food or warmth. The first song had happened, he remembered, on an evening after a long and difficult day, sung by someone who was tired, and whose tiredness had in some way crossed the threshold into a different state, a state in which the accumulated weight of experience became for a moment a kind of richness rather than a burden. And the richness had expressed itself as sound organized into something that was neither speech nor noise, but the thing in between, the thing that would become music. He held that song. He held every song that had ever followed it, from the earliest mortal music made with voice and hand struck stone, to the elaborate compositions of civilizations that had not yet arisen. All of it present in the same deep current, all of it equally held, equally preserved in the permanent record of what had occurred. He thought about a gesture, a small one, a mother in a village by a river, in an age so early that the village had no name, because the concept of naming places had not yet been invented, reaching out in the night to lay her hand on her sleeping child. No words, no thought or no thought that had words attached to it yet, just the movement of a hand through the dark, toward the warm breathing presence of a small body, the touch, the brief reassurance, of the child's continued existence, of the fact of their sleeping safety, of the ordinary miracle that they were here and breathing and warm. That gesture had happened once, in one specific moment, in a darkness so old that no record of it existed anywhere in the world except in Chronos. He held it with the same care he held the great events, the cracking of the egg, the emergence of Phanes, the rising of Olympus, the fall of Troy, The first prayer sent down through the water to the god of the sea. The gesture was not lesser than these things. It was different. It was smaller in its scale and larger in its intimacy, and it was in the arithmetic of what mattered, neither more nor less important than anything else he held. It was simply part of the whole, part of the vast, accumulating, never-finished record of everything that had ever occurred in the world. He was the record, not a passive record, not a stone tablet on which events were inscribed, and then left static to be read or not read by whatever came later. A living record, a record that was itself a living thing, that held everything it had ever received, not as preserved specimens in amber, but as part of its own ongoing existence, as the material from which it was continuously made. Everything in him was still alive in the sense that it was still present, still part of what he was, still contributing to the quality of his existence, the way every moment of a life contributes to the quality of the person that life has made. He thought about the things that mortals believed were lost. This was the thought that he returned to most often, not because it troubled him, but because it was the thought that he most wanted to hold steadily and clearly, the thought that seemed most important to carry without distortion. Mortals believed that things were lost. They experienced loss as one of the central and defining facts of their existence, the loss of people they loved, the loss of places they had known, the loss of their own earlier selves as time carried them forward through the changes that constituted a life. They experienced these losses as absences, as holes in the fabric of what existed, as things that had been present and were now simply not present. He understood why they felt this. The loss was real. The person who had died was no longer here, no longer available to be spoken to, or touched, or simply present in the same room. The place that had been destroyed was gone from the surface of the world, replaced by something else, accessible now only in the imperfect and fading medium of memory. The earlier self was unreachable by any direct means, could not be returned to, could only be glimpsed in the involuntary moments of recognition that came less and less frequently as the distance grew. The loss was real. He did not want to minimize it. Loss was the honest and accurate name for what mortals experienced when time carried something away from them. And yet, nothing that had ever been was gone from him. Nothing that had ever been fully present in the world had left the world entirely. It had left the present, that narrow moving point of contact that was the only part of time mortals could directly experience. It had moved from the present into the past, and the past was not nothing. The past was the largest and most permanent part of time, the part that could never be changed, the part that grew with every passing moment and never shrank, the ever-expanding record of everything that had ever occurred. The person who had died was in the past, was in the permanent and unalterable past, was as real there in that past as they had ever been anywhere, as real as they were on the day they were born, as real as they were on the day they were loved most completely, as real as they were in any moment of their life. The past did not diminish them. The past preserved them in the only preservation that was genuinely permanent, the preservation of having happened, of being a permanent and unremovable part of the structure of everything that had ever been. He held this truth carefully. He knew that it did not resolve the grief. He knew that the comfort it offered, if it offered comfort at all, was a cold comfort by mortal standards. The comfort of knowing that what you have lost is permanent somewhere you cannot reach, preserved in a way you cannot access, real in a mode of reality that is not available to the living. This was not the comfort of reunion or return. It was something quieter and harder, and in its own way more honest than those. It was the comfort of permanence, of the fact that love, having happened, was now permanent, that the gesture in the dark, the hand laid on the sleeping child, was now and forever part of the universe in the only way that anything is permanently part of the universe, which is by having occurred. He moved through the world carrying this truth in the way he carried everything. Through the cities that mortals built, and the cities that fell, and the new cities built on the rubble of the old ones, not knowing what was beneath them, not needing to know. He felt the layers beneath every city, the accumulated archaeology of human time, each layer a different world, a different way of being alive, a different answer to the same fundamental questions about how to live and what to love, and what to do with the short and luminous interval between birth and death. He felt all the layers simultaneously, the way he always felt all of time simultaneously. The Bronze Age village beneath the classical city, beneath the Hellenistic city, beneath the Roman city, beneath whatever came after, all of them equally present, equally real, equally held. He moved through the landscapes that had changed beyond recognition, the forest that was now a field, the field that was now a sea, the mountain that had once been a seabed, its limestone full of the shells of creatures that had lived and died in a shallow ocean 100 million years before the first mortal had looked up at the sky and asked a question. He felt the shells in the limestone, and felt the creatures that had made them, and felt the sea they had lived in, and felt all the time between that sea and this mountain as a single continuous presence in his existence, not a long time but simply time, as immediate and accessible as any other part of what he was. Nothing was far away from him. The oldest thing and the newest thing were equally near. The first morning of the world and the morning that was happening right now, in this moment, in every place on the surface of the earth, where the light was arriving fresh and new over the horizon. These were not separated by distance in his experience. They were adjacent. They were part of the same continuous existence. The same current that had carried the first morning was carrying this morning. The same breath that had moved around the egg was moving through the world right now. He thought about what it meant to remember. Mortals remembered in the way that suits their nature, selectively, imperfectly, with the particular distortions that come from the fact that every act of remembering is also an act of reconstruction, that memory is not a photograph but a living thing that changes each time it is accessed, that is shaped by the present moment in which it is recalled as much as by the past moment it is recalling. Mortal memory was beautiful in its imperfection, in the way that a hand-drawn map is beautiful, not for its accuracy, but for what it reveals about the consciousness that made it, for the things it emphasizes and the things it leaves out, for the unmistakable evidence it bears of a particular mind making sense of a particular world. His memory was different. He did not remember. He held. The distinction mattered. Memory implies a gap between the rememberer and the remembered, a distance that must be crossed each time the memory is accessed, a reaching back. Holding implied no such gap. What he held was not in the past in the sense of being far away, being separated from the present by a distance that required traversal. It was simply in the whole of what he was, accessible not by reaching back, but by being present to his own existence, which contained everything equally and without hierarchy of distance. He held the egg. He held the dark before the egg. He held Fane spreading his wings in the first light. He held the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age and all the ages that had come after. He held the cracking of the egg and the building of Olympus and the war of the Titans and the long grievance of Poseidon moving through the sea lanes of the Mediterranean after Odysseus. He held the gestures and the words and the songs and the prayers and the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones, the lives of the famous and the lives of those who had never been named by anyone except the people who loved them. He held all of it, not as a burden, never as a burden, as the substance of what he was, as the continuously accumulating richness of a life, his life, the longest and largest life in the history of everything, that had been present at the beginning of all things, and that would be present at whatever end all things move toward, carrying in its vast and patient current everything that had ever passed through it, giving it the only immortality that was genuinely available, which was the immortality of the past, the permanent and unalterable and absolutely reliable truth that what has happened, that what has been felt, that what has been loved, and that none of it, not a single moment of it, not the smallest gesture in the oldest darkness had ever truly been lost. The world turned, the seasons moved through their faithful cycle. The mortals slept and woke and lived their brief bright lives, and laid them down at last into the past where Chronos would hold them forever. The gods moved through their long immortal stories, and those stories too accumulated in the deep current of his existence, becoming part of the vast record of everything. And Chronos breathed, and held, and was, and the accumulation continued. One moment added to all the previous moments in the endless and patient and beautiful arithmetic of time. The accumulation continued its patient arithmetic. One moment laid down upon all the previous moments in the deep sediment of everything that had ever been. And Chronos held it all in the same vast and unhurried presence. And the world turned, and the seasons breathed, and the current moved in its slow and faithful way. And slowly, in the way that all deep things move slowly, something changed. Not in the world. The world continued as it had always continued, filling itself with its own story, adding moment to moment in the endless forward movement of events. Not in him, exactly. He did not change in the way that things change when an external force acts upon them, does not change in the way that mortals change, accumulating the visible marks of time on their bodies and in their minds. He was time. Time does not age. Time does not move toward its own end the way mortal things move toward theirs. What changed was the quality of his attention. It had been moving toward this for a very long time, since the first breath around the egg, since the first coiling of his serpentine body around the shell that held all things in their unformed perfection. Across all the ages, the golden and the silver and the bronze, across the rising of the Titans and the rising of the Olympians and the age of heroes and all the ages that had followed, there had been a direction to his experience that was not the direction of time moving forward, not the river's direction, but something more like the direction of deepening, of settling, of a thing moving not forward or backward but downward, toward its own most fundamental nature, toward the still point that had always been there beneath the movement, the silence beneath the sound, the ground beneath the river. He was arriving there now. He moved through the world in the long hours before dawn, in the time that mortals called the deep of night, the hours when sleep was heaviest and the surface world was most quiet, and the distance between the ordinary experience of time and the deeper nature of time was at its smallest. He moved through sleeping cities and through the dark countryside between them, through the forests where the nocturnal creatures moved in their quiet ancient way, through the shores where the sea came in against the land in its slow tidal rhythm, through the mountains where the stone was old enough to remember the sea it had once been. He moved without urgency. There was no urgency in him now. There had never been urgency, not truly. Urgency was a mortal quality, belonging to beings whose time was limited, whose future was finite, who had real and practical reasons to move through their days with a sense of forward pressure. He had never had those reasons, and had never experienced that quality of pressure. But in the earlier ages, in the fullness of the world's story, there had been a quality of engagement in his existence that was, if not urgency, at least a kind of active attentiveness, a quality of being fully turned toward the world and its events. He had watched the Olympians with that attentiveness. He had followed the mortal lives with it. He had felt the accumulation of all things in him, with a quality of active reception, and ongoing openness to what was arriving. Now that quality was stilling, not closing, not shutting out the world or withdrawing from the engagement with everything that moved through him. Still open, still receiving, still carrying all things in the same patient current. But the quality of the reception was changing, deepening, becoming less like watching and more like being, less like attending and more like containing. The difference between a river actively gathering what flows into it, and a sea that simply is, that holds without effort, that receives without reaching. He was becoming more fully what he had always been. He thought about the egg. He had thought about the egg many times across the long ages, had returned to it the way you return to the place where something important began, not to relive it but to understand it more completely from the perspective that only a great distance of time can provide. Now he thought about it differently than he had thought about it before. Now he thought about it not as a beginning, not as the start of the story, the first event in the long sequence of everything, but as an image of what he himself was. The egg had contained everything, all of creation, all the mountains and seas and gods and mortals and words and gestures and songs and prayers and ordinary days. All of it had been present inside that shell in the dark before the world began. And what had he been coiled around it? Not separate from it, not outside it in any meaningful sense. He had been its condition. He had been the time in which the egg existed, the medium through which it moved from potential to actual, the breath that warmed it, the presence that made its ripening possible. He had been in some sense the egg itself, the outside of the egg, the time that surrounded and sustained the everything inside. And now, all these ages later, with the egg long cracked and its contents long dispersed into the world and the world long filled with the everything that had been waiting inside, now he understood that nothing had changed. He was still what he had always been, still the medium, still the condition, still the outside of the egg, except that the egg was now the world, and the world was now everything, and everything was still held in the same patient coiling presence that had held it before the first light came. He settled into this understanding slowly. It was not a new understanding. It was the oldest understanding, the one he had been moving toward since the beginning, the one that the beginning had always contained in seed form, and that the long ages had been slowly bringing to its full expression. He settled into it, the way a stone settles into a riverbed after a long journey downstream, not arriving somewhere new, but arriving at the place that had always been its destination, the place that its shape and weight had been moving it toward all along. The past stretched behind him without limit. He let his attention move through it the way you let your gaze move through a landscape of great depth and beauty, not fixing on any single point, but resting in the whole. Letting the whole be present to you at once without the need to examine any particular part of it. The dark before the egg, the first light of fanes, the golden age and its warm slow mornings, the silver age and its first experience of anticipation, the bronze age and its walls and its hardness, and its ordinary days full of the same small gestures of care and connection that had filled every age before and after it. The Titans and the Olympians and the heroes and the sailors and the farmers and the mystics sitting in their stillness, and the mothers laying their hands on sleeping children in the dark. All of it was there, all of it was here, all of it was him. The future stretched ahead without limit. He let his attention move through this too, though moving through the future was a different kind of movement. A movement into what had not yet occurred, into the potential that still lived in the unformed part of time, the part that had not yet been pressed into the permanence of the past. He felt the futures that were coming, not as foreknowledge in any specific sense, not as the ability to say what would happen on a particular day in a particular place, but as the general quality of the time that was still ahead, the broad character of what was still to come. There would be more ages, more mortals, more gods in new forms and new names, more cities built and fallen, more ordinary days full of ordinary gestures, more moments of pure beauty breaking through the efficient surface of lives moving through time, more grief and more joy, and more of the long middle territory between them where most of life was lived, more songs, more words, more hands laid on sleeping children in the dark. All of it would come to him, all of it would pass through him, all of it would be carried in his current, and then laid down in his sediment, and held permanently and without loss in the deep record of everything that had ever been. He felt no impatience for it. He felt no impatience and no reluctance, no eagerness and no resistance. He was not waiting for the future in the way that mortals waited for things, with the forward lean of desire or dread. He was simply open to it, as he was open to everything, as he had always been open to everything, with a complete and unconditional receptiveness of something that is equally present to all of time, and therefore equally present to what has not yet happened as to what has. The present moved through him. This was the thing he wanted to stay with now, in this deepest and most settled part of his existence, in these long quiet hours before the dawn of whatever day was coming. The present, that narrow and extraordinary moving point where the past and the future met and were briefly, completely, the same thing, where what has been and what is yet to come converged into the single luminous fact of now. The present was always moving. He felt it moving through him with the same quality of movement it had always had, continuous, complete, the river's current at its most essential, the pure forward motion of time expressing itself in the only moment that was directly experienced by anything. The mortals experienced it as a line, as the moving edge of their lives cutting through time. He experienced it as a point of infinite depth, a place where the full weight of everything that had ever been and everything that would ever be was concentrated into the single fact of this moment, this breath, this turning of the world. He breathed. The breath moved through the world the way it had always moved, in the slow and patient rhythm that had been the first rhythm, older than the heartbeat of the first mortal, and older than the tides of the sea, and older than the orbits of the stars. The world drew toward itself, the night air moving gently inward in some quality of motion that was not physical but was felt nevertheless, the way you feel the presence of something very large and very still in the dark, even when you cannot see it. Out. The world released, the same gentle movement in the other direction. The breath dispersing through the sleeping landscape, through the forests and the fields and the shores and the mountains, reaching everything, touching everything, carrying in its passage the quality of something that had been breathing since before breathing was a concept. He felt the tides. They moved in their faithful and eternal rhythm, pulled by the moon that Chronos had been watching since it first found its orbit, that bright and patient companion of the earth whose regular movement had been one of the first reliable markers of time for mortals, the first clock, the first calendar, the first evidence that time moved in cycles as well as in lines. The tides came in and went out and came in again, and each coming in was the same as every other coming in, and completely different from every other coming in. Same rhythm and new water, same moon and new night, the eternal and the passing woven together in each single tide the way they were woven together in everything. He felt the stars. They turned above the sleeping world in their slow great circles, each one a sun at an unimaginable distance, each one burning with the patient fire of something that had been burning since long before the mortals below had looked up and given them names and organized them into patterns that told stories. The stars were old. They were among the oldest things in the world, older than the mountains and older than the seas, older than the Titans and the Olympians and all the generations of mortals who had sailed by their light and prayed under their light and told their children about the shapes they made in the dark sky, but not older than Chronos. He had been here before the stars. He would be here after them, when their long, slow burning finally exhausted itself, and they went out one by one across the immense darkness, each extinction a small and permanent event laid down in his sediment, held in his current, part of the ever-accumulating record of everything. He felt the world sleeping, the mortals in their beds and the animals in their dens, and the birds in their trees, and the fish moving slowly through the dark water, and the insects folded into the bark of trees, and the seeds in the ground already beginning the slow process of becoming what they were going to be in the spring that was coming in its own time, in the time that Chronos was already carrying, already holding in the current that was always moving toward the next season and the next and the next. The sleeping world was the world at its most honest. In sleep the complicated surface of things relaxed and what was underneath became more visible. The breathing, the warmth, the fundamental biological fact of being alive, the body doing its ancient maintenance work in the dark, the mind dreaming in the loose and associative way of things freed briefly from the tyranny of purpose. The sleeping world was the world as it was before it decided what to do with itself. Simply alive, simply here, simply breathing in and breathing out in the same rhythm that Chronos breathed, the same rhythm that had been the first rhythm, the breath around the egg. He coiled around it. This was the thought that arrived last. Arrived with the quality of something that had been waiting to be thought for a very long time, something that had been present in every age and every breath and every moment of the long accumulation of his existence, and that was only now, in this deepest and most settled hour, arriving in its full simplicity. He coiled around the world the way he had coiled around the egg. He always had. The world was the egg, opened and expanded and filled with all the everything that had been inside it. And he was still what he had always been. The time that surrounded it, the breath that sustained it, the patient and eternal presence coiled around the outside of everything, holding it not by force but by nature, by the simple and total fact of being the medium through which all things existed. Ananke was still here too. She was always here. Necessity and time, wound together as they had always been, as they would always be. The two conditions that made the world what it was, not a random collection of events but a story, not a chaos of forces but a cosmos, a thing with an inside and an outside, a thing that moved according to its own deep nature, a thing that was in the truest and most ancient sense of the word inevitable. The world was inevitable, all of it, every mountain, and every grain of sand, and every mortal life, and every gesture of care in the dark, and every song and every prayer, and every moment of pure beauty breaking through the efficient surface of a busy day. Inevitable not in the sense of being without meaning or choice, not in the cold sense that nothing matters because everything was always going to happen anyway. Inevitable in the deeper sense, in the sense that the egg always contained what it contained, that the nature of things always expressed itself as the nature of things, that what the world was had always been what the world was going to be, and that this was not a constraint but a completeness. He breathed in the long, slow inhalation that had been the first breath, and was also this breath, and was also the last breath. The same breath, always the same breath, moving through the same world that had always been the world and that was always going to be the world. Out. The world released into the night, through the forests and the fields and the sleeping cities and the dark shores where the sea came in against the land in its slow and faithful rhythm. The same rhythm it had kept since the first water gathered in the first low places of the young earth. The stars turned above, the tides moved below, the mortals slept in their warmth and their dreaming, the seasons leaned toward their turning, and Chronos coiled around the sleeping world in the deep and quiet dark, his scales the color between silver and darkness, his three heads still, past and present and future resting together in the same ancient calm, no longer three separate faces but three aspects of one face, one gaze, one attention turned toward everything and toward nothing, toward the whole of what had been and the whole of what would be, in the single eternal point between them where the world was always completely and entirely here. The breath moved, in, out, in. The world slept. The river moved and was still. The moment that had always been arriving continued to arrive, as it always had, as it always would, carried on the current of the oldest and most patient presence in the history of everything, unhurried, unchanging, unending, the deep and quiet and eternal breath of time itself, moving through the dark like a river that has always known where it is going, like a tide that has never once forgotten how to return, like the first light pressing through the thinning shell of the world, gentle and certain and already here, already here, already here. Sleep now. The current will carry you. It always has.